Jane probably needs no introduction, especially in this crowd, but I think chances are most people in the room today have seen her speak or read her work, but I'll introduce her just in case, since her first time, that she's an organizer first and foremost, a negotiator, author, a writer and commentator on labor, all things labor, and a scholar, currently a senior policy fellow at UC Berkeley's Labor Center. And she also leads regularly, maybe you've been to one, an Organizing for Power, an online training course that multiple, that thousands of workers across the world have participated in. And I'll just say on a personal note that I think what I most learned from Jane is that organizing really means reaching past the people who already agree with you to build that super majority of support, everyone and anyone. And I learned from her that that's even possible, which I think is pretty incredible in this polarized world. So I'm grateful not only that she's coming here to speak to us at EWOC, but also for bringing that message of hope to so many young workers and organizers. She's written 4 books on labor organizing, and they've been on tactics and strategies, and we'll talk some about that today. How to organize mass numbers of workers into unions, which is the goal, what we're doing. And her most recent book is actually the one on that we're discussing, Rules to Win By, Power and Participation in Union Negotiations, and it came out earlier this year, and it focuses on mass participation in contract negotiations. And I'm really happy to say that if you are interested in purchasing this book at a 45% discount, you can email us at school@workerorganizing.org, and I'll just put it in the chat here. And just put in the subject heading, Rules to Win By 45, and we'll get back to you on how to purchase that book for 45% discount. But you have to send it to us. This is the trick. Send it to us within the next hour and a half by 10 p.m. Eastern, so that we know that you came here today and that's why you're sending us that note. And I'll say that Rules to Win By is her 4th book after No Shortcuts, Organizing for Power in the New Gilded Age, Raising Expectations and Raising Hell, and A Collective Bargain, Unions, Organizing, and the Fight for Democracy. So huge amount of knowledge. So excited to have you today. I'm going to pass it along to Abby and Jane to take over from here, and hope to see people emailing me for that discount.
Thanks so much, Stephanie, for that introduction. And it's really such an honor to be facilitating this conversation and kind of having my EWOC world and my work with Jane collide tonight. I wanted to talk just briefly or give a brief story of my own relationship to Jane's book, No Shortcuts, which I'm sure many folks on this call have devoured and earmarked and highlighted the hell out of. And I first learned of it sitting in my office at the Seattle Labor Temple, where I was working as a strategic researcher for the Unite Here, the hotel and hospitality workers local there, and just overheard my coworker and organizer that I really respected telling a cook who was organizing the cafeteria at the Facebook office in Seattle that he had to read this book, that this was going to be his roadmap for organizing his shop. And I thought, no, I have to read this book too. And was just in awe of this work that was simultaneously, a peer-reviewed, Oxford-published academic work that was also just this incredible document that captured successful campaigns and preserved the history of worker organizing and struggle, and was a roadmap that workers were using in real time to organize their shops and to win really important fights. So a few years later, when I was a grad student at Berkeley getting my law degree, I had the opportunity to work with Jane as a graduate student researcher on a similar project that was focused on kind of accomplishing those same goals, but looking at negotiations and how unions go to the negotiating table. So Jane, to start, I would love to kind of have you situate the book in your own life and organizing a negotiating career in the context of your previous works that Daphne outlined, and then also just tell us a little bit more about what's in it.
Well, the most important thing that we haven't said is that Abby Lawler is the co-author of the book, which, to find Abby Lawler as in her period of her life when she was a graduate student was a complete dream for me. I'll just say that. So the nice thing about this moment in academia is, as you know, from graduate students organizing and themselves forming unions, when you're at an academic center, you get to hire graduate students. And so, I went out looking for like sort of a dream graduate student and then got one, which is perfect. So I think I would situate the book. Sort of in the book, we say in the introduction, it builds directly from No Shortcuts. And I think it really does. It essentially extends the arguments of what we think of as real organizing. No invention of mine, no invention of Abby's, by the way. Organizing is not an invention of mine. Nothing I talk about, maybe that's not true actually when it comes to negotiations, but very few things that I talk about when it comes to organizing would be anything I would claim to be new. There's an emphasis I place on some things differently than a lot of trade union leaders, like the emphasis of the role of the community and the emphasis of workers as whole actors. And I'm quite militant about a lot of the methods that my mentors taught me in the 1199 tradition, which is sort of a CIO, Congress of National Organizations tradition from the 1930s and 40s. So this isn't an exact. This book is basically how do you take what's an organizer's approach to negotiations. And that really has never been written down. And it was actually a large team of people in Germany, where I've been doing a lot of work with German trade unions in 2019 and early 2020. Pandemic kind of shut it down until it forced it online. And they were like, yeah, you don't just walk in the room and do it. So why don't you actually just like write a book? They initially said, why don't you just write up, like a report? So Abby and I set out to write a report. We wrote a report, and then a bunch of academics were like, you're fools. Like, put more in here and make it a book, because it really needs to be a book and people really need it in their hands, and people aren't going to see a report. And I thank those academics because I think they're right. So now there's a much bigger discussion about what does it mean to build, or how, I think situating the question of like doing union democracy is what this kind of negotiations are about. I, for one, get a little bit tired by a lot of talk about union democracy without people ever saying what it means. And I think that big and open and transparent negotiations is the most radical form of democratic trade unionism that you can get, because it's situating the thing that's most important to the most amount of workers in any campaign or any workplace. And you're putting them directly in decision-making about the document that's going to govern their lives and their work rules for most hours of their day. To me, that is doing union democracy. And this book is about actually making union democracy by doing union democracy. So I think that's a nut of it. And I don't know if you want to add to that, Abby, before I share some slides.
No, I think you should roll right in. And
all right, go right in. Abby's directing me. Going right in. Here we go. Boop, ba-doop, ba-doop, boop.
Just to say, I think we're going to take the next little bit of time and have Jane run through some of the kind of core elements of successful negotiations campaigns that are highlighted in the book as well.
All right. So here we go. There's the books. Definitely mentioned them all. So we don't have to say anything except one comment. I wrote theory and practice up there. The truth is, I'm not talking about academia. I'm talking about the real world. Like for me, and I hope for all of you, at the beginning of every single organizing drive that hopefully leads to a first contract fight. I mean, honestly, most of my negotiations have been, not all, but most have been first contract fights, because as an organizer, I've helped workers win a lot of big campaigns. And so therefore you go into the first contract fight. And at the outset, every single campaign, for me, sets up an experiment in real time. Not just can we build to 90 or 95% unity? Can we apply the methods very diligently that often lead to victory versus defeat? Not always, but often. And there's usually some element that we're going to try out in every campaign. Sometimes it might be jointly signing workers up on political contribution cards at the exact same time they sign their first ever membership card, just to get across the point that almost everyone is going to need to have some decent, they're hard to find, but, you know, DSA and EWOC and everyone else can try and elect better ones. But we, you know, to show that political power actually matters. And we certainly are going to watch. We certainly are watching. I'll give one example of that for those who are skeptical. You know, the role that Karen Bass, the mayor of Los Angeles, put into office by progressive folks, the outcome of the 60,000 worker education strike this year that she played a really key role in. You know, if you've got a politician, I mean, they're mostly not very helpful people these days, but if you've got one who's on your side and you're in a hell fight against an employer, it's going to make a hell of a difference in your fight. So that's a quick comment about theory and practice and an example. I don't know any union on planet Earth that ever did that exact experiment. Like, we're going to sign people up for political contributions at the exact same moment we're signing them up to become union members. And it worked fabulously, by the way, because it forced us to clarify and have a discussion about the relationship between workplace power as the foundation of working class power, and then the role of politics as a secondary form of power. So for our side to win, it's going to run through some core concepts from the book. For our side to win, we'd say one, high participation is a prerequisite, right? The other side has all of it. They own the media, they own half the politicians, they own the military, they got the police, they got a lot of power. Our side has one power, which is, can we actually bring the potential only of the slogan, the 99% versus the 1%? Can we make it real? Like, can you make that real in a workplace? Can you actually bring and manifest really high participation of really high numbers? Otherwise, it's just a throwaway slogan, and throwaway slogans are not of particular interest to me because they don't help. But really, our one weapon to win a first contract and everything else our side wins is, can we build really high participation, sustain it, and have methods to do that? And there's a common, you might have heard this already, there's a common saying in around union negotiations, which is, you know, what happens, you know, you win by what happens away from the table. It's like a very, again, another common ism, a phrase people will say in the trade union movement. And I think the argument we're making in the book is, by the way, not only, I mean, certainly what happens away from the table, all the good organizing that happens is fundamental, but actually we're positing an argument here, which is actually what you do and how you do it at the negotiations table also really fundamentally matters to, are you going to continue building a democratic, small d democratic organization? Are the workers going to learn how to govern in the workplace, and a lot more. So the three concepts explored in the book, and I'm going to go fairly quickly because then we're going to go to question, answer, and discussion. The three concepts are: one, do you have a big and representative committee? Two, is everything you're doing transparent, like really fundamentally transparent to all of the workers covered by the contract? And then three, are the negotiations open? And I think we want to clarify, we mean open to all the workers covered by the collective bargaining agreement. And that actually matters, I think, both for legal reasons. I have sustained, I don't know, a lot of legal challenges by a lot of employers to not open the room. And part of how we got around it was being very clear that we don't mean open to everyone on planet Earth. We mean open to the workers covered by the agreement. Because in fact, we can argue successfully that every single one of them has something credible and important to contribute to the knowledge at the negotiations table itself in terms of how a place works. So what do we mean by big? This is what I mean by big. Hundreds of workers, many deep. I think there's about 130 in this picture. This is a break during negotiations. Yeah, that's a nice big day at negotiations. That's just another quick image for you of a big committee. They're sort of stacked 3 or 4 deep around a very long table. And these are pictures from break times during real negotiations that I have had the great pleasure of leading with great workers. So what do we mean by representative committee? You're going to see numbers in here because in the book, there's 20 elements, we say, 20 elements to high participation, high power negotiation. So you're going to see me referencing just a few key ones. I am not going through all 20 right now. I just want to represent a handful of them. So a representative committee, in our mind, is a committee that's elected by work area and by shift, if you're a multi-shift facility. And electing committees can be a form of what we call a structure test. We hope that you know what structure tests are. If not, we'll show you what a few of them are, but that's a whole other class on organizing. But it can be a form of a structure test because the way that I like to hold elections, again, especially you're in a first, this is really, I mean, in general, but really relevant for first contract, where there's no one's been elected to govern really anything yet, right? You've won the union and now you're trying to figure out how to get a contract. You can hold very informal, but also serious elections by work area. You can put out a flyer and say, well, the way we do it is we say, the first part of the structure test is we're going to have launched a contract survey. Super important. Come back to it later. We will have launched a contract survey as a key step in the transition from the organizing drive into the negotiations. And we will say to workers, once 60%, once 60% or more, and you can pick a higher number, but I don't think you should pick a lower number. Once 60% of you have actually filled in the contract survey, then you you have the right to then elect a member of who will become a member of the negotiating committee, but not until or unless you've actually gotten 60% of all workers participating in the contract survey. Why? Because the point of the book and the point of what we're teaching is every single thing is an excuse for participation, for increasing participation, and for teaching people from day one. What you win in this contract is in direct relationship to how many of you are participating and at what level. So that's fundamental. You don't get to elect a committee member until you've showed that you can get 60% of your shift and your work area to fill in the contract survey and have workers actually have a lot of conversations about what do they want to win. We also think, and again, this won't be hard if you're in a first contract fight, but even in successor contracts, I'm a big fan of unpaid committees, often very controversial, as are many of these items, depending on what union we're talking about, but volunteer and not paid. There's no for me, it's been very hard in real life as a negotiator to make a demand on an employer that they need to let 500 workers in the room and that they're going to pay them all on paid time. You just, if you want to build a small democratic organization that's going to win, it's pretty hard to make a demand that they're all going to be in paid time status. So I've long ago surrendered it. And I would argue that in my life experience have had badass committees at every level, because you get the right people coming to the committee, not the people who are there because they don't want to go to work all day. They want to sit in a small room with 5 people and a lawyer and spend the day negotiating, often in air conditioning, if it was Vegas, for example. Those are not the right people that you want fighting for you on a committee. So this is an example of an election flyer, actually. One of the very flyers that we put out. You can begin to build excitement. This is a flyer we put out where about a half of a hospital had actually elected their team. And so a simple, what we call a pick and quote flyer, picture and quote flyer. And you can see, the very first one, John Raymond Murphy on the top. I am happy to be a winning team, and I'm willing to fight for everything that the patients and the nurses need. So you can tell this is a negotiations in Philadelphia, which I'll talk about several times. And there's a whole chapter on this in the book. And you can see in the middle, departments that have already elected their negotiating team: labor and delivery, emergency, surgical intensive care, progressive care, departments that are currently running their elections, and it lists who's got their elections underway. And then obviously you're showing, not telling, you're showing people, hey, all these other departments hit 60% on the contract survey, we can too. And by the way, we're going to get left out if we don't hurry up and get this done, because there's a bunch of other people are going to start making decisions on our behalf, and no one really wants that. So it's also very motivating. Another aspect of transparency we just want to highlight before getting into discussion is the concept of ratifying demands. You'll hear lots of unions talk about, people have to ratify the contract. Sometimes they don't, sometimes they turn it down. in my life, I have always practiced that workers have the right to ratify their demands for several reasons. Again, why? Because we do huge meetings explaining what their coworkers have built, the huge meetings before that, where any worker is welcome to come and have a say in what's going in the contract. Then it all is typed up. And then we actually want workers to come look at what the conclusion is that we're going to put across the table. So that in my life, I've never had someone ever say to me at the end of a contract, I never knew that was going across the table, or, I didn't have any say in what went across the table. Yes, you actually did. We had giant meetings and we took really serious votes. And you could change things right up until the contract goes across the negotiations table. So ratify demands ahead of time so that every single worker actually knows what's in the contract that's about to be negotiating. Okay, so I mentioned those subcategories. Another key concept of transparency is putting out a very simple two-sided negotiations bulletin before the boss. Super important. Frame the message before the boss does. So again, you'll see a lot of images or pictures and quotes. My preference for a negotiations update is very different than most unions who put out these like detailed long things with every little thing that happened. I'm going to have a bunch of workers with cameras in their hands, given a job to take pictures and interview their coworkers during the day of negotiations and ask them, what's the most important thing that happened today? And that's a simple negotiations report. We're going to get it out. We're essentially going to have it done by the time we've finished. We're going to have a member of the committee run to the nearest Kinko's or whatever it is, photocopier, and they're going to print it out. And there's going to be a team of workers waiting, and they're going to come back and they're going to grab those flyers and run through the facility. This is if you're doing a single facility, right, versus some kind of national or remote deal, and just run them through. You can use Instagram, you can use all sorts of other tools for different settings, but that's the one I've been in the most. So transparent concept number 13, again, really important, really important. I'm just going to say this again, really important, is avoid employer and lawyer communication between sessions. There has been a lot lately made of people saying that they're doing transparent negotiations of some kind, only for workers to learn that there's a lot of side bars and side talks going on between chief negotiators and management. That does not count as transparency. And I say avoid it because in my life experience, especially with email and stuff and texting and all the ways people communicate, the lawyers are, in the old days, they would pick up a phone, by the way, it wasn't a cell phone, just dating myself here. They pick up like a little thing on a cord and call you and try and get you talking. And that was like a no-no. And now they just send emails and how about this idea? What do you think about this idea? Do you think the workers might like this idea? And they basically just start trying to negotiate with you because they don't want to talk in front of the room. So don't do it. There's a way to do what we call an off the record, which we usually need to do near the end of a contract to get to victory. Abby and I can talk about that during Q&A, but avoid all that they try and draw you in. Do not let them draw you in at all and make it a principle of your negotiations. Article committees. I just want to mention these again. It's principle number 8 or element number 8 in the book. Over the years, I've evolved into this practice of having article committees, which means for every article in the contract, right? There's a contract, there's a bunch of articles in it, outlining your rights, outlining vacation, outlining shift pay, scheduling, the right to control your schedule, all sorts of stuff. I have taken to creating a committee for every single article of the contract and saying that you don't have to be a member of the formally elected committee to be on an article committee. Gets a ton of workers involved in the one issue they care really passionately about. And that's fine. Great. Like whatever's going to get them involved is great. If all they care about is health, welfare, and pension, that's fine, or vacation scheduling or drug testing or whatever it is. Because what they're going to learn very quickly is they're not going to win on that issue if we don't have the power to win on pretty much all the issues. So I'm happy to create as many vehicles as possible to get workers engaged and in the process itself. And then open negotiations. It's one thing to like tell people, sure, you can come sit in. And it's another thing to think as political educators. I think Daphne has that title, but as like your job as a negotiator is partly to be a political educator. Frankly, this is the job of every organizer is to do political education. And so if we said to people, come sit pay attention, you know, just come sit in the back of the room, don't say anything. And they have no idea what's going on. I was trained as an educator at a little place called the Highlander Research and Education Center in the Deep South. And I learned a lot about making it so that people didn't have boring times at meetings. Along with article committees, I evolved this idea of having article checklists. This is not so unusual, but it really matters if you're going to open negotiations up and you're going to do a big push to get a bunch of workers out one day for an important discussion. And this is so that it's updated at every single negotiation session. It has all the articles. It shows you the members of the article committee on the right-hand side. It tells you the article on the left-hand side. If it's shaded, it means there's a tentative agreement on it already. And then it tracks where we are. The dates in it are who initiated it, the employer or the union, and it tells you exactly where we are in that discussion. And so an article checklist really matters, because otherwise people are just sitting and they're bored and they have no idea what's going on. So that's a little bit on article checklists. And then I want to wrap up slides shortly. A really fundamental one to how does this all work? Like, how does it actually stay calm? And how do you avoid getting charges filed against you for the way that a lot of lawyers will attack open negotiations is by saying, or even big ones, is by saying that it's chaos, you know, that too many people are talking at once, you know, that you're not really negotiating. And 3 rules of the room when management is present, that's the key words here. These 3 rules of the room when management is present are fundamental to all the negotiations that, again, I've had the pleasure of leading. 3 simple rules: poker face at all times. There's a reason that we do poker face, and don't ever let the employer know what we're thinking. Either when we're winning, because we don't want them to know that we're happy about something they're doing. And certainly when we're not winning, we don't actually want to let them know that they're pissing us off. It just doesn't help. So poker face means you're not showing anything on your facial expressions. You can scream at the top of your lungs the minute they leave the room, not in front of them. Second, no one speaks except the negotiator unless it's planned. That helps avoid charges of chaos down the road. And frankly, it also just even helps on your own side to keep some level of order. And what makes it, unless planned really matters, because in our negotiations, tons of workers talk, like all the time, especially at the beginning when there's a lot of education going on about why issues matter. Because I might know a lot about negotiations, but I don't know a lot about every million issue that every worker I'm negotiating with. They know it way better than me, right? So they're going to speak a lot in the beginning, but it's going to be planned. We're going to have practice. It's going to be great. And the workers are going to be brilliant. And what makes it possible is the 3rd rule, which is the ability to send a note to the negotiator anytime. That's a key word in bold, anytime. If you do want to talk, or you want to let her know something, or request that we take a caucus, which means a break. A caucus is a legal term in negotiations, like where you can actually just have management leave the room. They can do it to our side too. They can just say, we need a caucus. It's a sort of a term used in negotiations. And we do it by putting out little index cards with like small mini pencils on every single seat in the room. And of course, you have some sense of how many are coming, because we've done a good job turning people out for negotiations. We know how big the committee is. I've had notes flying, like 80 workers at once. The boss says something stupid and 80 workers at once, just like handing notes through rows of people. And then they're just in front of me like a fan, and I'm just slowly looking at them as the boss is trying to talk, and they begin stumbling over their words because they're terrified about what they just said wrong. So that really helps people feel like they can speak, because I'm going to speak either for them, or I'm going to take a caucus and figure out, whoa, that was something really important. Let's take a caucus, come back and have a worker-led presentation. And of course, no cell phones, photos, or recording. By the way, that's not a throwaway line. I just didn't want to make 4 because there didn't used to be cell phones when I started this. So we don't want to be recorded by management, which means we don't want them recording us. Period. Because it can come up in arbitrations. It can be used in all sorts of really intimidating. It's usually used in really intimidating ways against workers. So just showing quickly some pictures of what structure tests are, so that people know when we continue to talk about them what they are. Structure tests are a sign that they're a mini campaign and they're a sign that you have actually, that you can manifest your high participation. You're showing it because you're actually setting out to get every single person, whether or not you ever liked them, whether or not you don't like them, whether or not you love them. A structure test is a way to force you to go and have conversations with every single worker covered by the collective bargaining agreement and see how many of them are participating. And they're endless. We say we do them endlessly because you do not know the effect of, and we'll get to this, the union busting employer campaign. You actually, it's one way that you can gauge the success of is the boss winning or not, is like, are your numbers dropping? You could start off strong and begin dropping because the work you're doing is not being very effective. And this is one way you're going to learn it, or because the boss's work is being really effective. And you need to constantly have like a pulse on what's really going on. And there's one way to do it. Ask workers to put their name on something that's going to be in public, put their face on something like a picture like this one, and then only put it out if it's a majority. I like to say a super majority, but you never would put one of these out with at least 55% of the workers on it, so that the boss, because the boss is going to count how many people, who is it, and it's high risk, and it's endless. And if you can't get a majority of workers to take actions like this, it's going to be hella hard to win a contract. Here's an example of one I was working on in Germany with the German team, and you can see the very informal wall charting that's going on the right-hand side. Charting is how you track. It's a tracking system to know whether or not the worker has signed or had their photo taken. In this case, that's like over 1,000 pictures, which was actually a super majority photo poster in Germany, in a lead up in one of 11 hospitals in a lead up to a 30,000 worker strike in Germany. And here's workers working. I'm going to end on this. This is workers working on what we call their wall charts. And that is the tracking system. This is not a class on organizing. We have a lot of them. We offer them. Definitely will tell you about them. Hopefully you've come to some of them, but just to remind you, it's workers who do all this work. This is not the work of paid staff. This is all the work of workers in big campaigns. And this is a tracking system. They're meeting. They're all, in this case, grouped up together around a medical intensive care unit chart. And they're trying to figure out who's participating, who's not, and why. And that's how you track your structure tests, is by wall charting. It's also how you figure out who, what we call the organic leader is. This is an example of a very well-organized unit. Whether it's a REI, a Trader Joe's, a hospital, I don't care, the workplace, everyone can wall chart. All you need is colors, markers, and a piece of paper. That's what the German one showed. They didn't even have the printed out cardboard I like to use. They just took the idea and drew it on paper and began tracking who has actually signed on to each one of our structure tests, who are we missing, is there a pattern developing, how are we going to go recruit them and move them if we need to move them. And it's also going to teach you what we call the organic leaders, who they are, because you're going to hand them the assignment and they're going to actually go and get either the signatures, or they're going to get the photos or the contract survey, and you're going to start to track who brought back signatures from what worker. And that's essentially a system of wall charting. And everything you see, every line, yellow dot on there is a different structure test. And this is 6 months in a campaign. So that's the night shift and the day shift. And you put every worker on there, not just a member, not just the ones talking to you. This only works if every single worker's name is on there. That's what you're testing. And that unit is in very good shape. We know who the leaders are. The workers correctly identified the leaders. There's one in the day shift and one in the night shift, driving all that success in the surgical intensive care unit. I'll show you a couple of them just to get a sense of it, and then we're done with this, which is, this is labor and delivery. It's a different unit in a hospital. And I love this method, and I was taught this method by my mentors, and I have never let go of it. I don't care about the computer database. I mean, I do, I care a lot about it. But what's much more important to me is the wall charts, because this is where we're teaching workers themselves what it means to build a big, representative, strong organization. The damn database ain't teaching anyone anything. It's just not, because the workers aren't looking at it, right? It's behind some computer screen. It's inaccessible. What's very easy to do is this. So in labor and delivery, you can see not everyone is participating in the same way as they are in the surgical intensive care unit. It's very much all over the map. That's a diagnostic, if you use the method, it means one of two things right away. It means either the workers incorrectly identified the leader, or they identified the correct leader, but that leader is not taking her job or his, my life, it's mostly hers, her or his job seriously in building the union. And so it's really uneven. Some workers are doing some, structure tests in this one, and they're not doing others. And it's just kind of a little bit messy. Not terrible, but it's a mess. It's a mess and it needs attention. Here's an example of a unit. These pictures were all taken at the same meeting, by the way. This is an example of what, if I could see all your faces, I would be asking you, but I'm not. This is an example of where the union busters had 100% control of the unit. And the name Marnay Payne, there's a whole story about her in the book. Her name is not blacked out in the middle column on the top. Neither is the activist, Liz Miller, who's on the bottom left on the night shift, where you see 3 dots and only 3 dots. Liz is an activist, totally pro-union, and completely not capable of overcoming the opposition of Marnay, who was the real leader in that unit's telemetry. And so nothing literally is happening in that unit. I mean, this is the same time as what's going on here. And that is the same unit, telemetry. Once Marnay Payne changes her mind, finally, we overcome the last of the big union busters holding out in some departments. And in like an hour and a half, she signs up a majority of the unit. That's what the yellow highlighter is, because they were so far behind, right? They will never have a chart that looks like these because they're so far behind. And that is their first majority structure test, and it's a hand signed one. I just want to show you a hand signed one. All right, that is it in terms of the basics of what's in the book and how do you link really great organizing methods to marry them to really good negotiations approaches that involve every damn worker. If you can do it, that's literally the goal.
And I should say I think almost all of those images were from a first contract campaign that Jane was a really integral part of at Albert Einstein Medical Center in Philadelphia. We have, I think, 2 other first contract campaigns that are also highlighted in the book, journalists and other media workers at the LA Times and also at Law 360, who had really long fights to win union recognition and then first contracts. I want to start digging in a little bit more into, there's so much in those opening slides. I think folks have largely picked up on this, but if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box, not in the chat. That's going to make it easier for the folks to pass them along to me. I'm going to start to sort of integrate them into a conversation with Jane, and then at some point we'll kind of pivot and be focused more exclusively on the questions that you all are submitting. So keep them coming in. But one thing I wanted to start with, Jane, you kind of kicked off saying that our central focus as unionists is to build really high participation and then maintain that over time when folks are fighting for recognition. I think there's sort of the singular focus on building the participation that you need to actually be recognized, whether that's winning an election or a card count. And then there's this transition moment. And it's often one that maybe folks haven't thought too far ahead towards. And you mentioned kind of moving immediately into a negotiating survey as a way to kind of keep participation going and make that transition. But I would love for you to just kind of say a little bit more for when your participation has been focused on winning recognition, you've achieved that goal, how to then kind of pivot and continue to build and grow participation towards a first contract.
Yeah, great. I mean, so there are times, just to be clear, there are times when you might actually have put out, I mean, a lot of what you have to do in the first contract fight is in relationship to what was done in the organizing drive, right? So that's like, if you've already charted the whole workplace, if you've already done a bunch of structure tests, if you've already done all that in the organizing phase of the campaign, then, you pivot right, I like to pivot and save the contract, a real contract survey, as the transition moment. I can say, I think when I was young and starting out, there were times in a difficult long slog election or card count campaign, where we would actually put out contract surveys as part of the organizing drive. I actually prefer not to do that now because there's so many other structure tests to do. And I personally, it's a really neat and tidy way to come into just to make the transition into the first contract fight. There's plenty of ways that you can like ask workers, to rank broad priorities. What are the top issues? And hopefully you're talking in one-on-ones to people, what the top issues are. You've had a meeting. So there's things you can do to like gauge what people's issues are. You've got to know what their issues are, or you're probably not winning that campaign to begin with. But to then formalize the shift. And we know in particular that mostly, if there were union busters in the fight, they ain't going home. They are not going home. They're probably flying in more. So having a really upbeat, positive thing to do at the moment that the union busters are going to start crashing back in on your reality, like, oh, you thought you won the election. Well, you ain't never getting a contract, right? I mean, that's what they're messaging to you. And so it's a great way to say, yeah, we are. And we're starting without you. And we're going to start actually having methodical, detailed one-on-one conversations again with every single worker, where we're going to inoculate about what the boss is going to be doing during the first contract fight, trying to stop it. So let's get back to focusing on what the issues are that you've come together and formed a union over, right? Which is a really great conversation that you can crystallize with that contract survey. And if you haven't done a lot of the work that I first described, which is charted the whole workplace, done any structure tests. I don't know how, I've never won personally NLRB elections without a lot of structure tests, but people are doing it somewhere out there. Certainly if you have a hot shop, you could do it. And what we call a hot shop, where workers are just really angry and really pissed off about something the employer did, can lead to very fast elections where very little is built. So there is this odd inverse reality. If you've won a quick election, you probably have a hell of a lot of building to do. Because in fact, you haven't had the time to chart the whole workplace and have significant one-on-ones with every single worker. So the burden is going to be even higher in the first contract phase on really getting the organizing fundamentals set. And a contract survey is like a great excuse to be like, hey, you don't have to say to people, hey, we never did those wall charts that we just saw in McAlevey and Abby Lawler's presentation. It's a great time to just be like, this is when we start charting, and just start. And build those wall charts and say, this is how we're going to track the contract survey, which are one-on-ones. And we're going to learn what every single worker thinks matters to them. What are their top 3 issues to change? And then we're going to have an opportunity for a one-on-one to explain what it's going to take to win. So you can just start it all right there. If you haven't done the wall charting, you hadn't done structure tests, you can start it with the contract survey. And that's a beautiful thing.
I think another thing, perhaps when campaigns have done that charting, or there's an awareness of, these were the folks who were anti-union going into the election. And you mentioned Marnie Payne briefly. I would love to have you talk just a little bit about, someone who was maybe ranked anti-union pre-election, how to think about those folks post-election, and the extent to which, yes, you have those pre-existing wall charts, but also what movement you might see in people once the negotiations actually start, when you're approaching them with a survey and a real conversation about what's at stake at the table.
Yeah, great questions. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are definitely a lot of campaigns where, because of the role of union busters, what I was taught by my mentors was a very high threshold for filing, which was 80% of workers on the petition. And why was I taught by my mentors at 1199 New England years ago, many decades ago, I can say now, that we would file with 80% for an election, because we knew the boss was going to shave about 25%. 25%. And so you had to have way more people engaged from the beginning to know that you could hold that number going into it. So going into the actual election. So then you hit this period where there is tension. There were people who were not for the union. Of course, you had coworkers who voted no or just didn't participate, right? Which is unfortunately a form of voting no, a more passive way of voting no, and then people actively voting no. So Marnay, but there's many of them. Sean, I mean, I talked about them in Raising Expectations too. My very first book, a character a lot like Marnay, I draw him out for a bunch of lessons too. He was a catheter lab technician from Las Vegas. Marnay was a nurse in Philadelphia. And they both were enormous leaders in their unit. And in the case of the tech, I'm talking about the cardiac cath tech, it was in a heart hospital, which if you know anything about this, which you may not, because maybe too young to have yet thought about heart attacks, but it's like the most important unit in a heart-focused hospital, because they stick the little things in your body and whatever, tell you what's going on. So, both of them played a role in literally delivering a ton of no votes and holding a lot of people back from participating. And it wasn't until the victory happened, often narrow, victory is often narrow, given the role of union busters. So you got to divide and shop, and your first job is you got to go get them. You're not going to win the contract you want to win if you can't go move those people. So as Abby is saying, it's like, it's a chance to just reset, take a breath, look at where you're strong versus where you're weak, and then make a plan. And I mean, make a plan to go figure out how you're going to move the key leaders. They are leaders. They are serious worker leaders. If they are holding people back in their unit or getting them to vote no. And your job is to go figure out how to move them. And the best way to do it is to talk about what they want to win and what they want to change. Now, really seriously, when there's a really serious union buster in the shop, the first thing that the union buster is going to do is coach every one of those anti-union leaders to never, ever speak to any of their coworkers, because they know that if their coworkers can start engaging with them, they're probably going to win them over. Why? Because in fact, every worker has a set of issues that they want changed, even if they're being told not to tell it to you, and even if they're being told not to talk to you. It is your job through charting and understanding those human social relationships, which is what wall charting teaches you, to figure out who are the right people to approach the Seans and the Marnays, who should do the approach. What do they need to know going into it? And there's nothing like, asking coworker to coworker, okay, if you could, let's just say you could change 3 things here, what would they be? I can say in the case of Marnay and Sean, they just wouldn't talk. They were like, I don't have any issues. I mean, these are real stories, right? Like, I don't have any issues. I love where I work. Okay. All right. Thanks. Good to know. Meanwhile, I know that they have issues because their coworkers have already told us what some of their issues are, right? So every worker has an issue. An effective one-on-one organizing conversation is actually how you're going to get it out of them. And there's no better way to do it than to have an approach to them with a contract survey in hand to start walking through what is it that they really want to see changed in the facility. And they may not move in one conversation, but in every single organizing campaign and first contract fight that I have, again, had the pleasure of leading negotiations at, or being the lead organizer and the lead negotiator at, they move, and they move for real. And I think, as Daphne said, it's like an example of what we have to do in the whole of society, right? Is not wall people off and say, you voted no, screw you. Like, you're going to win that way, because you got to get to 90% kind of unity to have a really, really effective strike. And so figuring out what it is that you need to do differently in the campaign to win them over is going to be foundational to whether or not you can win the first contract.
Yeah, there are a bunch of kind of questions that are coming in through the Q&A, and also in my mind as well, about how to think about expectations going into negotiations when people have never done it before. How long is it going to take? What's quote unquote realistic to put forward at the table? Are we asking for too much? Are we asking for too little? So I would love to kind of get your perspective on those questions. But before we get to that, kind of sticking with the union skeptical folks, the folks that you're really trying to move. I know you have an aspiration in the campaigns that you work on of every worker covered by the collective bargaining agreement or what will become the CBA attending negotiations at least once. And in my mind, that is such a good framework for thinking about, okay, what are the sessions going to look like and feel like when you actually get that person in the room? And so I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about, okay, you finally convinced this person to show up and see for themselves of what this is going to look like. What in your mind a negotiation session should actually be like for those people when they do come in.
That is great. And also, I should say that whether it was Marnay Payne or Sean, I feel like running to grab raising expectations, I'm spacing out his name right now, but that was 2005. It's a fairly long time ago. Sean, what's your last name? Anyway, I think fundamental to moving every really hard leader that I've ever had the joy of moving is being able to say to them, you can be in the room during negotiations yourself. In fact, I'm not sure that they would have moved otherwise. And that's like Scout's honor. And so that's a tactical reason for open negotiations. Like when you look at someone who union busters have had control of, have filled their brains with crap like Fox News does every day in America, but it's just happening at work to them. They're just being told one lie after another lie after another lie. When you can turn around and say, it's actually just not how it works. And why don't you come, and if it's before they start, in most of those cases, it was before they started that we actually moved them, but it was in the phase of the first contract fight. And being able to say, like, literally, you can walk in and watch every single session yourself to just see exactly what your coworkers are doing, is fundamental to winning the trust away from the union busters and back where that worker belongs, which is with their coworkers going into negotiations. And then what should it look like? Yeah, I mean, the truth is the 3 rules that I talked about earlier, a union skeptical, I mean, the danger is what our side does is we spend so much time talking to ourselves, so much time talking to only ourselves, that we just lose touch with what's happening if we don't do structure tests, and we don't go make ourselves talk to the workers so they're harder to move into the process. So I think when they walk in the room, those 3 rules that I discussed, no one speaks except the chief negotiator. You can pass notes anytime, unless it's planned, silence in the room and poker face, that stuff. I really believe that when we have brought them in the room, because it's happened, like it was one thing to get Marnay or Sean to sign a union membership card and then go sign other people up. It's quite another to get them in the room because they've been very invested in being seen as, they're invested on management side. I mean, it's actually in their mind. They've come to believe that they really think the union is this bad, evil thing that they've been told it is. And so I think, honestly, when they walk in the room, by the way, I dress for negotiations, meaning I dress up. And it matters to workers. In my life experience, it matters that I look, that I can go toe to toe with the idiots across the table and look kind of professional in the eyes of the workers, even if they come in their scrubs, even if they come in their shorts, I don't care. But like, there's a difference in what they expect to see. Is it, because again, these are the antis, these are the undecideds and the skeptical people. Our side doesn't care. Like I could care less if I showed up in overalls, you know what I mean? Or any of you showed up in whatever. But that's not who the focus of your work is. The focus of your work to win a great contract are the skeptical people in the workplace. And they need to walk into a room that's well organized, tight, effective, where it's very clear that we're in control and management is not. And that's what the article checklists are. You can fill them in, you bring them over to the side, you explain it. And absolutely, I remember when the undecided people begin to walk into negotiations and they just get impressed with like, our team looks really together. And our team is really together. Like we're showing what we're doing. You know what I mean? We are actually really together. And so I think it really matters. I think that expectation, Again, I was trained to speak to what we call speaking to the threes, which means you speak to the undecided workers in every lit piece and in every public anything you do. You are not waking up in the morning and speaking to the already converted activists. It's not going to help you grow the organization strong.
So I want to return back to the question I was kind of teeing up, which is really to, I think, how to sit with uncertainty and to do, I think, what you described, right, which is to show people that what they win is directly connected to participation in organization. But yeah, I would love to get your reaction for folks who are wondering how to talk with their coworkers again. What's realistic for us to be demanding or to win, or how long do we think this is going to take? Kind of those questions around what to expect from the process, how to address those and think about those.
Yeah. So first of all, I think it does really matter. I mean, I hope in the election phase that everyone explains to people that you don't win when you win the election, right? That's like the first step. And it's important that we've said that to people in the organizing phase so that they are not freaked out and disappointed when all of a sudden they're not going to the table. You know what I mean? So a form of inoculation and a form of political education that really matters is that you've already set it up so that people know that the second round of the fight's coming. And the second round of the fight is going to be a fight to win that contract. So the first thing is, so there's so many rules you can say at the beginning. One is you've done a good job already if you've ratified the proposals, which I talked about, if you've actually invited all the workers in and you've had giant meetings explaining what all their coworkers put together and pieced together to become the contract proposals. If you've done that process and you've ratified your proposals among your coworkers first in the entirety, in some ways that's another way that you can set expectations up correctly, because it's in those final meetings when you can say, these are some terrific proposals you've made, and boy, would the workplace run much better. Your lives would run better. This workplace would work better if you can achieve all of these. And the way that you're going to achieve all of these is to have 90 to 95 participation in this campaign the whole way through it. So again, everything is an excuse to also remind them of that this is not going to be won by a clever negotiator. This is not going to be won by anyone but you. And then secondly, it's good to say to people, look, the boss is going to try and drag this out as long as humanly possible. They might file charges, they might delay. Whatever they do, we're just going to keep going forward. Like we're going to do the contract survey. We're going to ratify our proposals. We're going to, there's many of these stories in the book and in certainly all the books, we're going to start showing up and just putting tables up where management is, if they're not coming to negotiations, on our lunch break, at a time when it's safe to do it, like off the clock, whatever it is. Like always make sure you're doing these things safely. But you can do them, right? We would just roll up chairs and start like mock negotiating with some jerk who would never walk in the room until we could get them in the room. So there's so many creative tactics you can do, but it's all about organizing, frankly. And can you force that employer to the table? And you're going to probably have to force them to the table. Let's say that you have an employer who then actually shows up. The other one starts to stall, drag it out, make it boring. They're supposed to make it as boring as possible, like especially when they realize that you're going to start bringing, that you have a large committee, that you're bringing a large number of workers. They're going to take a caucus, the boss, and say they'll be back in 45 minutes and disappear for 6 hours. And they can do that if you let them. And they will do that until your team is trained well enough to go hunt and find them and let them know that they're tardy by 5 hours and that they'd be fired for that if they were an employee. But anyway, yes, there's a lot. These are just all the regular things that happen. So the more workers understand the kind of games that management's going to play, the better prepared they are to just keep focused and keep fighting and keep organizing to win. Because there's a million distractions along the way. There's something called the 90-10 rule in negotiations. It's pretty much true, which is 90% of the entire agreement gets done in the last 10% of the time. 90-10 rule. 90% of all the decisions on the contract are made in the last 10% of the time. So if you know that going in and you've explained that to workers, then they understand why management is dragging and stalling and dragging their feet. And because they're not going to give you anything until you make them. That's what organizing is, right? You got to go make them surrender to you because you have that organized them. And obviously a strike, if, strike is not, there are workplaces where a strike is not going to be either the best way or maybe the only way. A few, like teeny little workplaces where no one's going to be affected, or they can replace you all in 5 seconds. Like, there's some things you have to be cautious about. But by and large, we're always building towards a strike, because a strike is going to be, in most cases, the vast majority of them, the absolute best weapon that you've got, but not a strike that isn't well planned, not a strike that isn't 90% out, not a strike that doesn't already have community support built into it, right? I mean, there's a lot that goes into having a very effective strike. And all of that work is work that you're doing in the negotiation session when management is trying to bore you. So having a plan every time you go to negotiations for what we call long caucus breaks is a fundamental part of your planning. Like, you never want the boss to take a caucus and walk out of the room for even just like a 2.5-hour lunch, break. And you've got no plan for what to do. A bunch of workers turned out, and now the boss is intentionally screwing off by taking a really long time out. Instead of letting frustration build, which is what most unions let happen if they do this, like people just get pissed off. Like, I took the day, I've got childcare, and now I'm here and nothing's happening. You got to have a really tight caucus plan so that there's a ton of organizing work ready to go. You've got to have your charts up, your list ready, phone calls to make. Maybe people are running into the facility. Like, there's any number of things. Maybe you're practicing effective one-on-one conversations during that caucus time. I've done a ton of that, right? You're like teaching the best work. You get the best worker in the room who does really good at one-on-one, get them up to start role-playing with other workers in the room. There are endless things that need to be done at every minute to run a good contract and a hard campaign. So having a caucus plan pre-thought and ready for when the boss tries to make it boring and awful is absolutely essential. Maybe you're going to phone bank the city council. Maybe you're all going to leave and go crash the state legislature. I don't know. Maybe you're going to go find the CEO somewhere and just be like, your people should be in the room negotiating and they're not here, and whatever, so you can get creative, but the creativity can't supplant the organizing. Can't. Creativity and fun tactics does not supplant. Can you get to 90% unity in the workplace? Creativity comes once you've done that. And that's the work that I've always got ready to go when there's a break in negotiations. The minute there's a break, like flip charts are rolled out, there's assignments ready to go, and you start planning and organizing right there. Who hasn't signed the structure test you're working on? Send a team to the facility, go get it signed while the boss is trying to waste your time. Like, put people to work and make it meaningful no matter what.
We have a ton of questions that are coming in, so I want to turn to those in a second. And unfortunately, I think I'm going to say up front, we're not going to get to them all. I think we're also going to do some work to try and combine some of the questions and make them a little bit more general, so we can get in questions that are helpful to the whole group of folks here. I want to ask one more, which is that you just, I think, gave a really good example of kind of not letting the boss dictate the run of show in sessions, people sitting around. I think 2 other things we talk about in the book as really important to just facilitating big, open, and transparent is rejecting ground rules and being really thoughtful about when and where negotiations are happening. So I wonder if you could just say a few more words about kind of those crucial decisions at the outset that really dictate down the road who's able to show up when, and how people are able to participate in the negotiations process.
Yeah. It's so funny that I just skipped over like that foundational one, because I almost just assume people know that already, but I don't think they do. That's why I wrote the book. So yeah, at the very beginning, the employer, even in that, when I was describing avoid employer communication right between sessions, it even starts, the first thing they're going to do likely is send you, whoever's designated as the contact to the lawyer for the other side. I've never negotiated against someone who wasn't a lawyer. So assuming it's a lawyer, they are going to send you some proposed ground rules. And they're just going to suggest we just sign these right when we get into the room. Or they're even going to suggest that you just negotiate them yourselves, you know, to you, the negotiator and the negotiator. And you sign these little things called ground rules. And as we say in the book, and as my mentors taught me a long time ago, ground rules are a permissive subject of bargaining, not mandatory. So there's mandatory subjects of bargaining and there's permissive subjects of bargaining. And ground rules are permissive. It's a tiny number of exceptions. Public sector California, you have to talk about them for 5 minutes and then you can dismiss them. You can say you talked about them, but like there's a handful of places where there's an exception. But by and large, certainly in the private sector, the entire National Labor Relations Board, ground rules are permissive. Under state law with state and public sector workers, there's some nuance here and there. But all you have to do is discuss them. You don't have to agree to any, right? Even under those rules. So ground rules, the most typical ones that many unions sign, including many unions that are currently on strike and more, are rules that include gag orders that say that they won't talk to the media during the negotiations about what's happening in negotiations. And the most offensive one, which is very common, is a ground rule that says if you're on the negotiating team, it's a 5-person small little team, you cannot talk to your coworkers. Like our side signs ground rules that says we can't talk to our coworkers about what's going on in negotiations. And the thing that I was told by my mentors, another one of many rules I've never violated, is I've never signed them in my entire life, not once, ever, and won't. Just like they also said, don't ever two-tier an agreement. Never have, never will. I don't care what the pressure was, don't. But anyway, so ground rules and gag orders are fundamental in the beginning. And just say no. That's it. No, thank you very much. It's a way for you to take control at the beginning of negotiations. And it's all about controlling the room. Negotiations is about controlling the room. And it's going to be a hell of a lot easier to do when you walk in with 100 people or 20 or 50 or a majority of your work site, whatever the size is, small, medium, or large. And, you know, not signing off on those ground rules and never agreeing to gag orders is fundamental to practicing high participation, high power negotiations.
Jane, thank you so much for this conversation. And
thank you.
With that, I will pass it off to Daphne to close us out.
Appreciate you all. And have a wonderful, wonderful night.
Go Ewok. Great work. Great work, everyone. Go get them.